On a frozen mountain road, a retired Navy SEAL driving a taxi heard something no radio could explain. Two children, alone, freezing, and no one was coming for them. He thought it was an accident. Until the children whispered a truth so disturbing, it made his war memories come rushing back. That night, armed men came to the cabin, guns drawn, lies exposed, and by morning, the man who saved them was the one in handcuffs. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. High in the Colorado mountains, winter pressed its weight onto a narrow road where snow erased tracks as quickly as they were made, and a lone taxi moved through the dark like a thought that refused to sleep. Jack Miller had learned the geography of silence. It lived between radio static and the hum of tires on packed snow, between the breath he remembered to take and the one he forgot. Driving nights was easier. Fewer mirrors, fewer eyes. The mountains didn't ask questions. He told himself it was just work. Another shift, another loop between nowhere and nowhere. But the truth sat heavier. Night driving kept the dreams at bay. When the sun went down, memories followed rules, blurred, distant, manageable. Daylight made them sharp. Jack kept his hand steady on the wheel. He focused on the road, on the white lines half buried by snow. He did not think about the years when roads were something else entirely, routes with numbers and names whispered like prayers. He did not think about men who never made it home. Beside him the dog lifted its head. Not sudden, not alarmed, just alert. Jack felt it before he saw it, a tightening in his chest, a quiet wrongness. The dog's presence anchored him, a reminder that not every instinct ended in blood. The animal trusted the world in a way Jack no longer could, but it trusted Jack enough to stand with him inside it. Headlights cut through the snowfall, and then Jack saw them. Two shapes where no one should be. Children. Jack's foot eased off the gas before his mind caught up. The taxi rolled forward, slow, cautious, as if approaching something sacred or dangerous. The kids were huddled together near a frozen turnout, arms locked around each other, bodies bent inward against the cold. They did not wave. They did not run. They waited. That was what struck him hardest. Not panic, not movement. Waiting, like they had learned stillness was safer than hope. Jack stopped the car. For a moment he stayed where he was, engine idling, breath shallow. A part of him, the part trained to calculate risk, listed reasons to keep driving: remote area, night, unknown variables. Another part, older and quieter, asked a simpler question: if not you, then who? He opened the door. Cold rushed in like a reprimand. The dog jumped down first, not aggressive, not playful, just present. It moved between Jack and the children, stance firm, reading them the way Jack once read terrain. The kids flinched but didn't scatter. That told Jack everything. "You're freezing," Jack said. His voice sounded strange to him, unused. "Can you walk?" The older boy nodded, jaw tight. The younger one didn't speak, just pressed closer to her brother. Jack recognized that posture. He'd worn it himself once, when fear was too big for language. Jack offered his jacket, then stopped, too fast. He remembered how sudden kindness could feel like a trap. Instead he crouched, lowering himself to their level. "I'm not the police," he said. "I drive a taxi. There's a cabin nearby, warm. You can come with me or stay here. Your choice." Choice mattered. He had learned that too late for some people. The boy swallowed. "Warm," he said. "Just the word. Nothing else." Jack nodded. He opened the back door and waited. The dog stepped aside, granting passage like a silent oath. The children climbed in, movement stiff, controlled. Survival manners. As Jack drove toward the cabin, the radio crackled. He turned it off. Silence again. Better. His mind began to race now that the decision was made. Questions piled up, sharp and insistent. Where were their parents? Why were they alone? Why here? He did not ask. Not yet. The cabin came into view, a dark shape against darker trees. Jack cut the engine and listened. No gunfire in the wind, no voices where there shouldn't be any, just snow and breath and the creak of old wood. Inside, the cabin smelled of cold and pine and a life lived sparsely. Jack lit the stove, hands moving from habit. He gave them blankets, poured warm water into chipped mugs. The kids held the cups like fragile things, steam fogging their faces. Only then did Jack feel it, the tremor in his hands. He turned away so they wouldn't see. This was the part he hated. The moment after action, when the adrenaline drained and left him alone with himself. His mind replayed old footage, tried to splice it onto the present. Children became something else. Snow became smoke. He squeezed his eyes shut, breathed, counted. 1, 2, 3. The dog sat between him and the kids, calm but watchful. Jack envied that steadiness, loyalty without history, courage without memory. "You can sleep here," Jack said eventually. "I'll stay up." The boy looked at him then, really looked, not grateful, assessing. Jack respected that. "Why?" the boy asked. Jack considered the question. He could give 1,000 answers. He chose the truest one. "Because it's cold," he said, "and you shouldn't be out there." Later, when the kids finally slept, still curled together, still guarding each other, Jack sat alone by the window. Snow fell thicker now, erasing the road entirely. He wondered, not for the first time, if rescue was just another word for postponing pain, if he was helping them or simply delaying something worse. He wondered if his brokenness would leak into them the way cold seeped through walls. The dog rested its head against his knee. Jack did not move it away. Outside, the mountain held its breath. And for the first time in a long while, Jack allowed himself to believe that stopping had been the right call, even if he didn't yet know the cost. Morning crept into the mountain cabin slowly, pale light reflecting off endless snow, turning the silence outside into something almost gentle, as if the night were pretending nothing cruel had happened. Jack Miller woke before the children, a habit drilled into him long before taxis and mountain roads replaced patrol routes, and for a few seconds he forgot where he was, his body rigid, mind already scanning for threats that did not exist, until the quiet breathing nearby grounded him back into the present. The cabin was still, the stove reduced to a dull warmth, the windows rimmed with frost, and the dog lay awake, not tense but aware, sharing the same half-sleep vigilance Jack had never managed to unlearn. Jack sat up slowly, careful not to wake the kids, and listened to the morning, to the way snow muffled everything, to how the world felt paused, like a held breath. This was the hour he usually dreaded, when darkness gave way to clarity and memories sharpened, but today his thoughts were pulled outward instead of inward, circling the question he had avoided all night: who these children were, and how they ended up alone in a place that could kill them if they stopped moving. When the older boy stirred, Jack waited, letting him wake on his own terms, watching the instinctive way the child checked on his sister before anything else. And that small motion pressed something heavy against Jack's ribs, a recognition that had nothing to do with sympathy and everything to do with familiarity. Eventually the boy sat up, eyes wary but clearer than the night before, and Jack poured warm water again, slid the mug across the table, and said nothing, because silence sometimes invited truth better than questions. It was the boy who broke it, voice low, measured, introducing himself as Ethan, then nodding toward his sister Lily, explaining who they were in the simple way children do when they have learned that too many details make adults uncomfortable. They had been playing a game, he said, hide and seek, something their stepmother suggested while they were staying at a mountain lodge with her, a game that sounded harmless enough until Ethan explained how she told them to wait, promised she would come back, and never did. Jack felt a tightening in his jaw, not anger yet, but the warning sign that anger was forming somewhere deeper, and he forced himself to keep his voice even as he asked when this happened, how long they had been waiting, how they ended up so far from the lodge. Ethan answered carefully, choosing words like stepping stones across cold water, explaining how daylight faded, how they got scared to move too far because she had told them not to, how the cold came fast once the sun dropped, and how they hugged each other because it was the only thing they could think of to stay warm. Lily did not speak, but she nodded at the right moments, fingers still gripping her brother's sleeve, as if letting go might make the story fall apart. Jack listened, his mind splitting in two directions, one tracking facts, timelines, distances, the other sinking into the emotional undertow of it all, into the image of two children standing obediently in the snow because an adult told them to, because obedience was safer than questioning, and that image collided violently with memories Jack rarely touched, of orders followed because they were orders, of consequences never explained until it was too late. He asked about their father, and Ethan hesitated, then said what sounded rehearsed, that their dad worked all the time, that he was always on calls or traveling, that he trusted their stepmother to handle things because she said she could, because she smiled when she said it, because adults like that always seemed convincing. Jack noticed the way Ethan's shoulders tensed when he spoke about his father, the mix of loyalty and resentment that Jack recognized all too well, because he had been both the man who left and the man left behind in different chapters of his own life. He thought about how absence could be a kind of neglect, even when it paid the bills, how being physically present did not always mean being there, and how easy it was for children to learn not to expect anything more. As the story unfolded, Jack felt the dog shift closer to the kids, not intruding, simply aligning itself with them, as if some old memory inside it recognized abandonment as a smell, a sound, a pattern. Jack wondered briefly what the dog had lost before finding him, and whether that loss was what made it so attuned to the vulnerable. He considered calling the authorities immediately, the correct procedure, the responsible choice, but something held him back, not fear of consequences, but an unease that this story was incomplete, that the version told to these children was not the whole truth, and that handing them over without understanding the shape of the lie might return them to danger rather than remove them from it. He told them they would stay for now, that they were safe, and he meant it, though the word safe felt heavier than it should have, a promise he was not sure he had the right to make. As the children ate the simple breakfast he prepared, Jack's thoughts drifted to his own past, to a younger version of himself who believed structure could fix anything, who trusted systems because trusting people was messier, and he felt that old conflict rise again, the pull between protocol and instinct, between what he was trained to do and what he had learned the hard way. He watched Ethan watch him, the boy's eyes sharp, measuring, and Jack realized the kid was studying him the same way Jack had studied threats once, cataloging behavior, tone, mood, trying to decide if the adult in front of him was reliable or just another temporary shelter. That awareness made Jack unexpectedly careful, aware that every movement, every word, was being weighed. He kept his hands visible, his voice calm, his reactions slow, even when the familiar edge of hypervigilance crept in, because he did not want the children to see the fracture lines in him yet, did not want to become another unpredictable element in a world that had already taught them unpredictability was dangerous. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and relentless, sealing off the cabin from the road from easy exits, and Jack felt the isolation press in, not as panic, but as responsibility, the knowledge that for the moment he was the only adult standing between these children and whatever had abandoned them on that mountain. He told himself it was temporary, that answers would come with daylight and phone calls and verification. But deep down, he sensed that nothing about this was simple, that hide and seek was too neat a cover for something darker, and that the night he thought was over had merely changed shape. As Ethan finished eating and asked quietly what would happen next, Jack met his gaze and said the only honest thing he could, that they would figure it out together, and as he said it, he felt a tremor of fear not for the children, but for himself, because some part of him already knew that once he stepped fully into this, there would be no easy way back to the solitude he had built to survive. Night returned to the mountains with heavier snow, pressing against the cabin walls, while darkness gathered inside as well, turning warmth into a fragile illusion and silence into something that watched back. As evening settled, Jack Miller felt the familiar tightening begin long before his mind named it, a slow constriction that came whenever light faded and the world narrowed to shadows and sound, because night had always been when memory stopped asking permission. He moved through the cabin methodically, locking the door, checking the window, feeding the stove, actions learned in places where mistakes were not forgiven, and all the while he was aware of the children watching him, not openly, but from the edges of their vision, the way prey watches weather. He tried to soften his movements, to slow his breathing, but habit fought intention, and when the wind rattled the walls, Jack's shoulders stiffened before he could stop them, his eyes darting to corners that held nothing but darkness and old wood. He told himself to stay present, told himself this was a cabin and not a perimeter, 2 kids and a dog, and not a unit depending on him to make the right call under fire, yet his body did not listen because bodies remember longer than minds forgive. The dog sensed the shift instantly, not alarmed but alert, rising and repositioning itself closer to Jack, a silent acknowledgement that something old had been stirred, and that simple loyalty both steadied and shamed him, because Jack hated being seen like this, especially by children who had already learned that adults could become dangerous without warning. Ethan noticed first, his gaze sharpening, as he took in Jack's rigid posture, the way his hand hovered near the table, as if expecting it to become something else. And Lily followed her brother's lead, drawing closer to him, whispering questions Jack could not hear but felt anyway, because fear has a weight that carries through walls. Jack tried to explain, not with words, but with calm, forcing himself to sit, to keep his hands open, to speak in a steady tone about ordinary things like dinner and the weather, and how storms passed eventually, but inside his thoughts fractured, slipping between now and then, between the cabin and places he had sworn never to revisit. And each small sound became an accusation, each creak a test he did not remember signing up for. He caught Ethan's eyes on him again, not accusing, just uncertain. And that uncertainty cut deeper than suspicion ever could, because Jack understood it too well, having grown up learning to read moods, to anticipate danger in the subtle changes of adults who never explain themselves. For a brief, ugly moment, he wondered if he was doing more harm than good, if bringing these children into his space had exposed them to another kind of threat, quieter but no less real, the threat of an adult who might lose control, not violently but internally, retreating behind walls no one else could see. The dog shifted again, placing itself where the children could see it, posture calm, breathing even, a living reassurance that whatever storm was inside Jack, it had been weathered before and survived, and Jack focused on that, on the animal's steady presence, using it as a tether back to himself. He remembered the first night after he left the service, waking in a rented room with his heart racing, convinced he was under attack, until the dog he had not yet met would one day fill that silence with meaning, and he realized with a jolt how thin the line was between protector and problem when fear went unspoken. He forced himself to speak, telling Ethan and Lily that sometimes his mind remembered things that were over, that it made him tense, but that he was not angry and not dangerous, that the feeling passed if he stayed still long enough, and he kept his eyes on the floor as he said it because he could not bear to see pity there. The children listened, exchanging glances, absorbing his words with the same careful caution they applied to everything else. And Jack saw understanding flicker there, not full trust, but something adjacent to it, the recognition that broken did not always mean bad. Still, when a sudden gust slammed against the cabin, Jack flinched hard, breath catching, and Lily whimpered despite herself, her fingers tightening in Ethan's sleeve, and the sound of it snapped Jack back into himself with brutal clarity, because, whatever his intentions, fear was contagious, and he was spreading it. He stood abruptly, muttered an apology that felt inadequate even as it left his mouth, and stepped outside into the snow, cold, biting through his clothes, grounding him in sensation, reminding him that he was here, alive, accountable. The night air burned his lungs, and he welcomed it, using the pain to push memory back where it belonged, counting breaths until the shaking eased and his thoughts slowed into something resembling order. When he returned, the cabin was quiet, the children pretending to sleep, though Jack could tell they were listening, and the dog met him at the door with a steady look that carried no judgment, only expectation, as if to say that fear acknowledged was not the same as fear surrendered to. Jack sat down near the stove, choosing the floor instead of the chair to make himself smaller, less imposing, and he stayed there through the night, eyes open, guarding not against enemies, but against himself, aware that the children's safety depended as much on his restraint as on his strength. As the hours passed, the storm outside intensified, snow piling against the cabin, isolating them further, and Jack understood that morning would not bring immediate resolution, that whatever this situation truly was, it would demand more of him than a single act of rescue. He listened to the children's breathing eventually deepen into real sleep, and felt a quiet resolve settle in, fragile but real, the decision to confront his own fractures rather than hide them, because if he was going to stand between these kids and the cold world that had abandoned them, he would have to make peace with the darkness he carried as well. And that realization lingered as the night stretched on, hinting that the danger surrounding them was not only outside the cabin, but tied to choices already made and others still to come. By morning, the storm loosened its grip, leaving the mountain silent under fresh snow, the cabin standing alone in a white stillness that felt less like peace and more like a fragile ceasefire. Jack Miller woke with the dull ache that always followed a night spent half awake, guarding his own thoughts as much as the door, and for a moment he lay still, listening, measuring the space between himself and the past, between the cabin and whatever waited beyond it. The children were quiet, too quiet, and that set his nerves humming until he heard the soft, ordinary sounds of movement, careful footsteps, the clink of something being set down, proof that life was continuing without his permission. He sat up slowly and took stock of himself, reminding his body that the danger it expected was not here, that the mountain outside held only snow and trees and unanswered questions, not gunfire or commands, barked through radios. The dog was already alert, not tense, just watchful, its calm presence nudging Jack toward motion instead of spiraling thought, and Jack followed that cue, pulling on his boots and preparing to head into town while daylight allowed the road to be passable. He told himself he needed supplies, food that wasn't rationed, something warm and decent for the kids, and maybe a few small things to make the cabin feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a place people could breathe in. But beneath that practical list was another reason he didn't say aloud: the need for distance, a short separation, to make sure the fracture lines inside him would hold. He told Ethan where he was going, how long he'd be gone, and what to do if anything felt wrong, hating that the words sounded like instructions to a junior teammate rather than a child, and Ethan nodded, absorbing the responsibility with a seriousness that made Jack wince. The drive down the mountain was slow, the road slick and narrow, and as Jack guided the taxi through curves cut into rock and ice, his thoughts drifted back to the night before, to Lily's frightened sound and the look in Ethan's eyes, and a sharp guilt lodged itself behind his ribs because he knew too well how it felt to realize that the adult in the room was not entirely safe, even if he meant well. In town, Jack moved quickly, buying food that required little preparation, warm clothes that didn't itch, and on impulse a couple of inexpensive toys he hadn't planned on, simple things that fit in one hand, wondering as he paid whether the gesture was for the kids or for himself, a way to prove that he could still be gentle. He returned to the mountain sooner than expected, unease pushing him to drive faster than he liked. And as the cabin came into view, Jack slowed abruptly, something wrong in the best possible way, because the place looked different, not in structure, but in feeling. Smoke rising more evenly from the chimney, the door cleared of drifted snow, the small details that signaled care. Inside, he stopped just past the threshold, surprise cutting through him cleanly, because the chaos he'd left was gone, replaced by order that hadn't been there before, the table wiped, supplies stacked neatly, the few scattered items folded and aligned with an attention that spoke of intent rather than boredom. The children stood awkwardly near the stove, watching him, waiting, and Jack felt his throat tighten as Ethan explained that they wanted to help, that they knew Jack was trying, that they had seen how tired he was, and how his hands shook sometimes, and that maybe if they made things easier, he wouldn't feel so bad. The words landed harder than any accusation could have, because they carried concern rather than judgment, and Jack had no defense against that, no practiced response for being cared for by children who had every reason to protect themselves first. Lily stepped forward then, holding one of the toys Jack had brought back, and asked if he liked it, her voice tentative but hopeful, and Jack realized with a jolt that she thought the gift was meant for him, not her, that in her mind he was the one who needed comfort, and the realization cracked something open in him he had kept sealed for years. He crouched down, meeting their eye level, and thanked them, the word feeling inadequate but necessary, and admitted simply that he did have bad nights, that sometimes his mind acted like it was still somewhere else, but that he was working on it, that he was not broken beyond repair, even if he felt that way sometimes. The dog settled near the children as Jack spoke, its presence reinforcing the truth of what Jack was saying without adding words, a reminder that survival did not have to mean isolation. Ethan listened closely, nodding, as if filing the information away, and said that his dad was like that sometimes too, distant even when he was in the room, and Jack felt the weight of that shared understanding settle between them, a bridge built from honesty rather than promises. For the first time since finding them in the snow, Jack felt the dynamic shift, not dramatically but subtly, from rescuer and rescued to something more complicated and more dangerous, a mutual recognition of damage and effort, of people trying to take care of one another with imperfect tools. He realized then that whatever came next, whatever answers daylight and phone calls and official channels might bring, this moment had already altered the shape of things, because the children no longer saw him as just the man who stopped the taxi, and he no longer saw them only as a responsibility to manage. As evening crept closer again, shadows lengthening across the snow, Jack felt a familiar tension rise, but it was different now, edged with purpose rather than dread, because he knew that tonight he would not be alone with it, that eyes would be watching him, not for signs of danger, but for signs of effort, and that knowledge both steadied and frightened him, especially when he noticed the faint tracks near the tree line outside the cabin, half buried but unmistakably not theirs, a quiet detail that suggested the mountain might not be as empty as he had believed. Dusk settled early over the mountain, snow dimming sound and distance, when a knock cut through the quiet with a certainty that felt practiced rather than accidental. Jack Miller felt it before he reached the door, a pressure behind the eyes that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with pattern recognition, the sense that this interruption did not belong to weather or chance. He signaled the dog with a subtle shift of weight, and waited, listening to the cadence of the knock, measured, confident, the kind that expected an answer. And when he opened the door, a man stood there claiming to be a caretaker sent to retrieve the children, his words smooth enough to pass a quick test, but his posture wrong, too alert, eyes scanning past Jack into the cabin as if inventory mattered more than relief. Jack asked questions he already knew the answers to, names and places, timelines that should have been simple, and the man responded with rehearsed vagueness that slid rather than settled. And as Jack listened, his attention dropped to the smallest tell, the tension in the man's shoulders, the way one arm stayed close to his side, guarding something heavy, and the dog's low, contained warning confirmed what Jack's instincts had already concluded. The moment stretched thin, and Jack made a choice that felt both inevitable and dangerous, stepping aside just enough to block the doorway while keeping his body between the man and the children, his voice calm, as he said they would need to verify everything in the morning, a refusal wrapped in courtesy. That was when the man's hand shifted, revealing the grip of a concealed weapon, and the air changed instantly, civility peeling away to expose intent. Jack moved without thought, the years collapsing into muscle memory, the door slamming shut as he shoved the man back into the snow, the dog surging forward with a controlled ferocity that was not rage but purpose, and the night erupted into motion as figures detached themselves from the tree line, shapes Jack had sensed earlier now, made real, advancing with the confidence of people who believed numbers would solve everything. The cabin became a point of resistance rather than refuge, and Jack felt the old clarity snap into place, the narrowing of focus that came when choices were reduced to essentials: protect the children, control the entry points, survive long enough to end the threat. He shouted for Ethan and Lily to get down, to stay behind the stove no matter what they heard, hating that the words sounded so familiar, commands echoing from a life he thought he had left. And as gunfire shattered the silence, snow exploding from the ground in sharp bursts, Jack registered pain in his side without letting it slow him, because pain was information, not a verdict. The dog moved like it had trained for this moment, intercepting one attacker and forcing the others to split their attention, and Jack used the opening to drag a heavy table across the doorway, buying seconds that felt like minutes, his mind tracking angles and distances, every sound catalogued, every breath measured. He thought briefly of the children, of how their trust had grown fragile and real, and that thought anchored him more firmly than any oath ever had, because this was not abstract duty, but specific lives, small and frightened and counting on him without understanding the cost. The attackers pressed in, desperate now that surprise was gone, and Jack fought them with what he had, refusing to escalate beyond what was necessary, because he knew too well how violence could spiral when fed by fear rather than control. When it ended abruptly, the remaining figures retreating into the trees. Once resistance proved more expensive than expected, the mountain swallowing them whole, leaving behind only silence and the aftermath of breath and blood and disbelief. Jack sagged against the wall as the adrenaline drained, the dog returning to him immediately, not seeking praise or reassurance, simply confirming presence, and Jack pressed his forehead briefly to the animals, grounding himself in the fact that they were still here. The children emerged slowly, eyes wide but steady, and Jack forced a smile that felt earned rather than performative, telling them it was over, that they were safe. Even as he knew safety was now conditional and temporary, he bound his wound as best he could, cleaned what he could not ignore, and made the decision he had been circling since morning, activating the cameras he kept for his own protection, devices he rarely mentioned, tools born from a life that had taught him documentation could be as vital as strength. Night deepened, and Jack did not sleep, sitting upright near the door with the dog at his side, replaying the encounter again and again, isolating details, memorizing faces, understanding now that this was not a misunderstanding but a retrieval, a deliberate attempt to take the children back by force, and that knowledge settled heavy in his chest, because it meant the danger was systemic, planned, and unlikely to simply vanish with daylight. When morning finally came, it brought flashing lights and raised voices, authority arriving late and loud, and Jack watched as the narrative was constructed around him with frightening speed. A man with injuries, armed intruders unseen by those who had not been there, children present without guardians, and before he could fully explain, hands were on his arms, not violent but firm, procedure unfolding with indifference to context. As he was led away, Jack caught Ethan's gaze, saw fear flare and then harden into resolve, and that look told him everything he needed to know, that whatever story was told next, it would not end with the truth buried under snow. The courthouse sat heavy and unmoved beneath a gray winter sky, its stone walls holding warmth poorly, as if even justice here preferred distance. And Jack Miller felt the cold long before he crossed the threshold. Jack Miller stood with his hands resting where he had been told to keep them, posture compliant, mind anything but, because confinement had a way of shrinking rooms and expanding memories, and the echo of boots on polished floors stirred an old resentment he worked hard to keep buried. He told himself to breathe, to catalog sensations that belonged to now rather than then. The smell of paper and disinfectant, the hum of voices beyond the door, the steady presence of the dog somewhere nearby, temporarily separated from him by rules that did not care about loyalty. He had spent the night replaying the cabin attack with a precision that bordered on obsession, not to relive it, but to organize it, to make sure nothing essential slipped away into panic or self-doubt, because he knew how easily narratives hardened once authority chose a version it liked. When they let him into the room, he kept his eyes level, resisting the instinct to scan for exits, because this was not a place where exits were earned through speed or force, and that realization made him feel strangely exposed, stripped of the skills he trusted most. The children were already there, seated with a social worker whose calm smile felt practiced, and Jack felt a sharp pull in his chest at the sight of them, the way Ethan sat upright, protective even now, and Lily leaned subtly toward him, seeking the same anchor she always had, and he wondered what story they had been told while he was being processed, how much of the truth had survived the translation. When Ethan's gaze met his, Jack saw something steadier than fear there, a quiet determination that made his throat tighten, because children should not have to learn resolve this early, yet there it was, unmistakable. The hearing moved forward with procedural efficiency, words like custody and endangerment floating past Jack without landing, because his attention was fixed on the children, on how they flinched at certain phrases, how Lily's fingers twisted together when the night was mentioned, and he realized with a dull ache that no outcome here would erase what had already been carved into them. Then Ethan was asked to speak, and the room shifted in a way Jack felt more than heard, because when a child speaks truth without ornament, it rearranges the air. Ethan's voice shook at first, then steadied as he described the night in the snow, the waiting, the cold, and then Jack, the taxi stopping, the door opening, the choice offered. And as he spoke, Jack closed his eyes briefly, not to hide, but to endure, because hearing himself described through a child's lens stripped away all his rationalizations, leaving only the essential fact that he had stayed. When Ethan said that Jack felt like a father, not because he claimed them, but because he did not leave, Jack felt something inside him crack open, a grief he had never allowed himself to name, the grief of knowing how much weight that statement carried and how little he had done to earn it beyond the act of remaining present. Lily spoke next, fewer words but no less impact, saying simply that the dog made her feel safe and that Jack listened even when he was scared. And Jack swallowed hard, understanding in that moment that the children had seen his weakness not as danger but as honesty, and that terrified him more than any accusation ever could. Their father was brought forward then, a man whose absence had loomed larger than his presence, and Jack watched as realization dawned across his face, the slow collapse of certainty into remorse, as his children's words dismantled the comfortable distance he had maintained under the guise of responsibility, and Jack felt no satisfaction in that, only a weary empathy, because he knew too well how easy it was to hide behind work when the alternative required vulnerability. The atmosphere tightened as the evidence was introduced, footage Jack had almost forgotten he had recorded, not out of foresight, but habit, a life spent documenting threats rather than trusting their disappearance. And as the images played, the room grew quiet in a way Jack recognized, the silence that follows clarity rather than confusion. The camera angles showed the approach to the cabin, the armed figures emerging from the trees, the timing too precise to be coincidence, and then the second stream, the dog's perspective, capturing movement Jack had sensed but not seen, and Jack felt a grim validation settle over him because the truth, once externalized, carried a weight that personal testimony alone rarely achieved. The narrative shifted visibly, suspicion sliding away from him toward a pattern that could no longer be ignored. And when the stepmother's involvement was revealed through phone records and arrangements laid bare, Jack felt a flash of cold anger, not sharp, but dense, the kind that forms when cruelty disguises itself as play, when a game is weaponized against trust. He did not look at her when she was named, because he had learned long ago that staring at perpetrators gave them a presence they did not deserve, and instead he focused on the children, on the way Ethan's shoulders finally eased, on the way Lily exhaled as if she had been holding her breath since the mountain. The decision came down with formal language that barely registered, because Jack was already thinking ahead, to what happened after hearings ended and doors closed, to how the children would carry this forward, to whether their father would learn to show up in ways that mattered, and to his own role in all of it, uncertain and undefined. As he was released, conditions attached, Jack felt a strange hollowness, relief tempered by the knowledge that justice was rarely the end of anything, only a pivot, and when the children were allowed to look back at him one last time, Ethan nodded, a small, solemn gesture that felt like a promise rather than a goodbye. Jack returned to the cold outside with the dog at his side once more, aware that while the legal story had reached a turning point, the emotional one was far from resolution because separation, even necessary, left marks. And he wondered how long it would take for the cabin to feel like more than a place where everything changed, especially now that the truth had finally surfaced and the cost of it was still unfolding. Winter loosened its grip on the mountain as thin sunlight traced old snowbanks, and the cabin stood quiet again, no longer a refuge under siege, but a place where consequences and mercy learned to share the same air. Jack Miller drove the taxi back up the familiar road with a restraint that surprised him, the engine's hum steady beneath his palms. The dog settled into a watchful calm that felt less like readiness for threat and more like acceptance. And he realized that for the first time in months, the road ahead did not demand vigilance, only attention. The hearing had ended, the evidence weighed, and the truth had taken its shape without asking him to perform for it. Yet relief came in uneven waves, interrupted by aftershocks of doubt that arrived uninvited, because endings rarely announce themselves as such when a life had been trained to expect recurrence. He parked near the cabin and stepped out into air that smelled of thaw and pine, and the silence met him without accusation, and he understood that the quiet was not emptiness, but permission. Inside, the cabin bore the careful repairs of someone who knew how to mend without erasing scars, and Jack let his hand rest on the table where fear had once been counted in seconds, acknowledging that memory did not vanish simply because danger had. He fed the stove and sat, listening to the small sounds that returned when adrenaline did not dominate the room and the dog chose a place near him, not guarding a door now, but keeping company, a subtle shift that felt like trust, reciprocated rather than owed. Days passed with a rhythm that rebuilt itself slowly. The taxi runs resumed, the mountain town accepting Jack back into its unremarkable flow, and he noticed how ordinary kindness required no justification when he allowed it, how neighbors spoke without lowering their voices, how the word kidnap was replaced by a nod and an apology that meant more for its restraint than its volume. The father brought the children back the first time on a clear Saturday, standing uncertain at the threshold as if unsure which of his mistakes the wood might remember, and Jack met him there with a steadiness that surprised them both, not defensive, not conciliatory, simply present. The children crossed the space without hesitation, their steps lighter than Jack remembered, and when they looked up at him it was not to ask permission, but to share a moment, and he understood that what had been built between them did not require possession to endure. They spent the afternoon doing small things that carried more weight than any promise, stirring soup, mending a hinge, letting the dog decide the pace of a walk, and Jack watched the father learn by watching, saw how listening altered his posture, how proximity taught him what absence had not, and Jack felt the unfamiliar warmth of being useful without being necessary, a distinction that loosened a knot he had tied long ago. When dusk came, the children left with reluctant smiles and plans spoken aloud so they would feel real, and Jack stood until the car disappeared down the road, feeling the echo without mistaking it for loss. The weeks that followed brought routine visits, then confidence, then laughter that arrived without scanning the room first, and Jack noticed how the dog's attention softened in parallel, instincts redirecting from threat assessment to shared exploration, and he felt grateful for the animal's unspoken lesson that survival could be a prelude rather than a conclusion. News traveled of the woman's arrest and the dismantling of the story she had told herself to justify cruelty, and Jack did not dwell on it, not out of forgiveness, earned or denied, but because attention had become a resource, he chose to invest where it grew something durable. On one clear morning, Jack drove the taxi lower into town and caught his reflection in the windshield, the familiar lines unchanged yet less severe, and he acknowledged that the war he fought now was quieter, waged against reflexes that mistook safety for complacency, and he won it by choosing to stop at the cabin even when no one waited there. The dog rode beside him, the bond between them shifting from mutual survival to mutual steadiness, and Jack recognized that the animal's past had taught it when to stand and when to sit, when to intervene and when to allow, a wisdom earned without words. Spring crept higher up the mountain, and the snow retreated into shaded pockets that glittered briefly before surrendering, and Jack felt something in his chest follow suit, not disappearing, but changing state, grief becoming weight rather than wound. On the last visit before school resumed, the children brought a small, earnest gift, a map they had drawn with the cabin marked not as an end point, but as a place along a route, and Jack accepted it with care, understanding the message without explanation that belonging did not require permanence, only reliability. The father stayed longer that day, fixing what needed fixing, asking questions that admitted vulnerability, and Jack answered without instruction, letting experience speak where advice might harden into pride. When they left, Jack closed the door gently and did not brace for the sound, because expectation had changed, and he sat with the dog and allowed the moment to be what it was, neither rehearsal nor aftermath. The town held a modest gathering weeks later, not to celebrate him, but to acknowledge a truth larger than any individual, that people who stayed mattered, and Jack accepted the thanks with a nod that redirected it toward the ordinary choices that had made the extraordinary unnecessary. He returned to driving the taxi through the long evenings, headlights carving patience into the road, and he noticed how often doors opened when someone slowed down long enough to knock. One night he parked by the cabin and watched the stars emerge, the dog's presence a steady point of warmth, and Jack spoke quietly, not to confess or bargain, but to name what he had learned, that vigilance without compassion calcified into isolation, that courage could look like waiting, that staying did not require ownership, only fidelity to the moment. He stood, stretched, and turned the key, ready to descend the mountain, not because he was leaving something behind, but because he was carrying it forward intact. Sometimes the miracle does not arrive as thunder or fire from heaven. Sometimes it arrives quietly, sent by God through ordinary hands, at the exact moment someone chooses not to turn away. Faith is not only found in prayers spoken aloud, but in doors opened, in patience given, and in love shown when fear would be easier. God works through those who stay, through those who protect the weak, and through small acts of courage repeated every day. In our own lives, we may never know which simple choice becomes someone else's answered prayer. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment to tell us where you are watching from, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and quiet miracles. May God bless you, guide your steps, and protect you and your loved ones today and always.